Hello, my name is Donald Craig. I'm living in Euphemia Township in southwestern Ontario, not too far from Newberry, Bothwell, and Alvinston. You should be able to find those on maps, some maps at least. I'm a graduate forester from the University of Toronto 51 years ago, and doesn't seem like that long, but it is. And my wife and I bought this property in 1984, and I called it the Little House on the Prairie because you could see the basement windows from 1.5 miles away. Now you can't see the house until you're about 300 feet from it. All of these trees that you're going to see on this video that are around the house we've planted since we moved here. We only had 10 trees growing on the property when we moved here. I was going to go into the nut producing business, and I got a bunch of chestnuts and filberts and Japanese heart nuts, and then decided maybe that wasn't such a good idea, because when I was retiring I wanted to go deer hunting, and I didn't want to be sitting at home waiting for somebody to show up to buy $5 worth of chestnuts. So now I'm cutting down chestnut trees and burning them in my wood furnace because I don't need the burrs on the ground. They're not good for the grandchildren's bare feet. At one time we had about 60 species of trees here, but I haven't counted them in the last 10 years. But I keep adding and in some cases subtracting. Whereas I'm standing next to a tulip tree that I planted in 1987. And we have a lot of Carolinian species here. But at one time, this area, even though it is called Carolinian Canada, when the settlers first arrived, there was a lot of actual boreal species here. The great Enniskillen Swamp had sections in it. One just south of Alvinston was about 4,000 acres. It was all tamarack. And along the edge of it, I knew a fellow that got his rafters from the tamarack bog. And my grandfather got on the same 50 acres Tulip Tree, Carolinian, growing side by side. One was a little higher elevation on a gravel deposit, and the rest of it was sphagnum bog. But the Drainage Act ended the Great Enniskillen Swamp. That's what it was designed to do, so that we could grow decent crops here. Maybe it was the right thing to do, and maybe it was a mistake. Time will tell. But right now, it's working for food production at least. In behind me, are you able to see that tree back there? That is not a shagbark hickory tree. That is a shellbark hickory tree, or a giant shellbark. But I know that because I planted it. But this time of year, when they're this size, it's virtually impossible to tell the difference between the two. But once the leaves come out, you can count the leaflets and you can tell which one it is then. I don't know whether there's any other. I got flowering dogwood over here that's also a Carolinian tree, and we have Paw Paws here. Lots of them. We're going to take a little walk around and look at some interesting things, especially if you're not familiar with things like blue ash and Kentucky coffee tree. You'll see a few of those, and then we're going to go over to a property in the next county. It's only 6 kilometers from here that my wife and I own. We call it Sherwood Forest. Yeah, this is a seedling from a thornless variety of honey locust. The original honey locust all had really massive thorns, maybe this long and multi-branched. They brought them, well actually they were native here as far north as this road right here in Ontario, but I've seen them growing in Renfrew. Black locust and basswood are the only two tree species in this part of Ontario that apiarists will put their beehives in and not charge you money for, because they'll get enough honey to cover it. This is from the Kentucky coffee tree. Seeds inside. Yes, and if you dry that stickiness out, then in order to get them to germinate, you've got to put them on either a file or an emery wheel to get down through that massive seed coat, which is probably half the thickness of the seed, and get down to where it's white, and then you put it in water overnight. And if it starts to peel layers off when it starts to expand, that's when you can plant it and it'll come up. Otherwise, it'll probably never, the water will probably never get through. When we moved here in 1985, you can see the pump house in amongst the trees here. Can you see it? And we could see across this block and all the way across the next rural block, there were no trees in the way. And so we've planted everything that you see here since 1985. The only trees that were here then are gone now. There's a big stump there the other side of the little garage that's about 6 feet in diameter. Before I was done, I got 150 feet out of that tree in four goes at it. I got 50 the first time, and then 42 the second time, and then 40 the third time, and then the last time there was only about 8 or 10 feet. So some people ask what they can grow for vegetables in the shade. This is it. Fiddleheads. Somebody gave me 6 of them 25 years ago. I've given away over 50, and I've never done anything to them other than cut them off in the spring and dig them up when they're in the way. I'm not sure there's a bad place to plant them, because I've seen them growing in creeks or rivers that flood in the spring, and you know, they might be flooded for a week or 2 weeks and they're fine. This is one of my seedling pawpaw trees. I was going to plant nut trees and go into the nut business, but then I figured out shortly before I retired that I was going to have to be here in the fall when I wanted to be hunting deer. So I didn't really go into the nut business, and then along came the lesser chestnut weevil. People ask me how many chestnut trees I had, and I sold them 35. Well, I've cut over 40, and I've got another 15 to go, plus the little ones that keep coming up on me. Some of these things in here are all on their own. I didn't plant them. I did plant this little Kentucky coffee tree here. He's not going very fast because there's so much shade to the south. I'm doing a bed here. I've got to cut some of chestnuts down so there's not shade on it. I'm going to plant about 600 Kentucky pawpaw seeds in here in the next week. But they don't germinate before the 10th of July. That's the earliest I've ever had one come up, is the 10th of July. And I've been planting them for 25 years, I guess. Now, this is why you don't plant pawpaws on a city lot. I planted the one back at the back here about 30 years ago, maybe 25, this one. These are not seedling pawpaws, these all came from the roots. And I know where there's one woodlot that they cover almost 2 acres, and they're probably all from one seed. So they spread out all over the place. Kentucky coffee tree are the same thing. I cut off 50 or 100 a year with a spade so they're not taking up space in the lawn. Now, one thing I will tell you, as far as I know, pawpaws are self-unfruitful. You don't need a male and a female, but you do need two. And this one was producing pawpaw flowers for about 5 years. And so I went to some other place and not getting any pawpaws. So I finally went someplace else and cut a branch off a tree, brought the flowers back home and pollinated these. And I've got another one. It's the same tree as this one, but I dug the two of them up and they were just root suckers. So they're the same tree. So that didn't work with them. So I got another one and then I started getting pawpaws. But this one, I probably got 4 11-quart baskets off of it last year. I had nearly 80 liters of pawpaws last year. See this? There's the flower buds just starting out. And you see how they're kind of a maroon color, and then they'll go green, and then they'll go back to, I would call it blood red, or because what pollinates these trees are carrion flies. So they stink like rotten meat. They're not the kind of thing you have in a bouquet on your kitchen table. Anyway, part of the issue with these, they grow up there and they're soft when they're ripe, and when they hit the ground, I can show you another bunch over here. They're a little taller than this one, and every one that hit the ground last year went splat. So I got the seeds out of them, but I didn't get any fruit per se. And these, by the way, are all American or Chinese chestnuts. This chestnut that looks like it's growing out of this stump, this is a Japanese heartnut stump.
And what happened to it?
I cut it down. Because most years we have a frost between Mother's Day and the 24th of May weekend, and all of the catkins on the Japanese heartnut end up freezing up. And I'm more interested these days in resurrecting butternut than I am the Japanese heartnut. But I have some massive Japanese heartnut trees here. Where this stub is here, and you see where the two little dead limbs are there that stick out from the tree? 1 year's growth, 9 feet. Japanese heartnut. And then I dug up about 180 pawpaws out of this little patch this spring. Gave them away to various people, including Carolinian Canada. And then there's a bunch of pawpaws there, and you can see all the flowers that are coming out on them. Those pawpaws, where I worked for the Conservation Authority, and across the river from property the authority owned were some pawpaws growing. So I dug them up and brought them back here in case the river changed its course, got decent roots on them, took them back and planted them on the opposite side of the river. And what you've got here is what I left in the ground. Where I cut the roots off, they came up, and that's what I've got 20 years later. Yeah, pawpaws are native. Some people say that the natives brought them here. Some people think that they came from the Underground Railroad. But they're in places where there were no Underground Railroad sections or anything, so you'll find them down along Lake Erie all the way to Niagara Falls. And there's actually a guy going around looking up records from the 1940s right through the 1980s from various researchers, and going and visiting those sites again where he can find them. And he may write a book about where, like, put all the coordinates back together and what's growing there now, what was supposedly growing there before, not just the pawpaws but the other species of trees and stuff as well. And he's got a lot of sites. He says the epicenter is Chatham, Kent, which doesn't have any trees, right? But I've put them in touch with a few sites. Because I grew up 8 miles from here. These are my high bush blueberries. I have 4 plants. Most I've ever got was from just 2 when I only had 2 plants, and I got 60 quarts that year. Want some asparagus? It grows wild on this sand. If you're going back through Newberry to get to Marion Ross's, you'll see people on the side of the road grubbing around in the grass. This is what they're after. I think it was this one here was growing on the side of the road up here, but the neighbors kept getting closer to it with their machinery, so I dug it up, filled a whole wheelbarrow with the one root. It's growing on people used to grow asparagus around here, and so it got into the roadsides. And I used to know a fella, 3 days of the week, he would take one of his daughters and they'd drive down the road and he'd kick the daughter out to go and get the asparagus. The kids didn't like it at all. He thought it was great. Now you can see these flowers on this pawpaw are a little more advanced. And I planted this one the same day I planted the first one I showed you back there. But look, there's only one sucker coming up from this tree. And the original tree is the part that's dying there. This one over here has lots of light. And it's about 7 years old. And I dug up 10 root suckers this spring and threw them on the burn pile, because I don't want them getting into my blueberry house. I've got enough pawpaws. When we moved here, we had 2 pair of robins trying to nest, 6 pairs of starlings, and some English sparrows. Now, this morning we had an indigo bunting at the bird feeder, and there were 2 of them. One of them may have been a female, but more likely an immature. But we have probably 15 pairs of robins. We have no starlings. We have lots of grackles. We have 2 pair of Baltimore Orioles, although at the feeder today we had 7. They just arrived the day before yesterday. Brown thrasher, cedar waxwing, a wren. You only get 1 pair of them at a time. This isn't big enough for 2. I'm not sure whether there's anything else. Oh yeah, 2 species of woodpeckers, red-bellied and downy, and mourning doves. All of that nests here because of the stuff that's coming up not too far off the ground. And in the wintertime, depending on which way the wind is blowing, I have windbreaks that go this way and windbreaks that go this way. And whichever ones are parallel with the direction of the wind, that's where the birds are that night. Have you ever seen a tree with square branches? It's a blue ash. Fraxinus quadrangulata, because of the apparent squareness of the twigs, which are, they're really not square, they just have these little wings that happen to be at right angles. And this one has been attacked by emerald ash borer 2 or 3 years ago, because you can see they call them water sprouts, these things that are trying to grow straight up, this one here. So we know that above that, and you can see where the woodpeckers have been trying to get the grubs out, where the bark is flaked off. And this tree flowers every year, has for the last 7 or 8 years, and I've never seen a seed on it. And I got another one down there by the road and it does the same thing. So, and have you ever seen a hickory in flower? You see that up there? See the green? People used to send me pictures of that and say, my hickory's in flower. Well, it's not. Those things that are turned down are the bud scales, and that's the leaves coming out. This is a hop tree or a wafer ash. It's not related to the ash at all. It is called hop tree because of this little fruit that it has on it, and it comes in bundles by the dozen. I give away several hundred seedlings last fall, and none of these, I planted one but it eventually died. All the ones that I've got around here are just ones that come up. They'll come up in my eave trough. Okay, here's your Shellbark Hickory, because it has, these are not last year, the year before's leaf stalks, and the year before that. And if you'll see some of these on Shagbark Hickory too, but if you push on them, they pop off. These, you see how they break rather than pop? They don't come loose down here, they break off up here somewhere. That's another characteristic. But you can imagine, these things in the forest look really ugly. Really. You want to, when you're looking at a tree, you like to look at a nice smooth stem. You don't like looking at this stuff. This is American hazel here. And you can see the disease. And you can see down there where it's killed it. But if this were a European hazelnut, they would just, the whole plant would be dead by now. Sassafras flowers. And there's one that's not quite broke out yet. And then this one is well out. I'm guessing that this is a root sucker. See this green? That's what sassafras normally looks like when it's young twigs. It's green like that. And I'm guessing it's coming up from this tree here. But I did find one growing way over by the barn, and I know that that's not from. Now, this is my favorite tree. Any idea what this thing is? Now, the thing that's growing up in behind is witch hazel. But this thing right here. And it's been here 25 years. Black gum. Nyssa sylvatica. And it's been sitting there for longer than that big Japanese heartnut that you saw was planted. And this, but it's typical of them. The oldest tree in Ontario is only 50 centimeters in diameter and is 584 years old. That is the oldest deciduous tree, and it's one of these down on the Niagara Peninsula. Now imagine the guy had 584 rings in 26 centimeters. Or was it 26 inches? Doesn't matter, it wasn't very much for 584. He had to use dye and a microscope in order to count the rings. These are Virginia bluebells. They're native around here. You find them in the floodplain of the Sydenham and Thames rivers. And where you find them, you can find massive areas, maybe a half acre, 2 acres in size, of virtually nothing but bluebells. They're usually out for Mother's Day. They're a week late this year. Originally, in 1997, I did an MFTIP for the owners of this property. And in 2007, they asked me, because they weren't able to spend any time here, they spent their winters in the Caribbean and their summers in Toronto in their condominium. So they wanted to know if I wanted to buy it, and I did. And I referred to it as Sherwood Forest when I was talking to the people that I worked with. And when I retired, they gave me the sign that's up here on the forest. So we've owned this since 2008, and we'll talk about some other things, even some prehistory on it as we go along and see some things here. Originally this was cleared for agriculture. All of this in the front and the next property too belonged to the same people. There was a house back in here. Apparently there's a well in here somewhere. I've never found it. But before we had artificial nitrate fertilizers, ammonium nitrate, this land was not very productive. Within a few years of taking the trees off, all the organic matter was burned out of the soil, and therefore your cation exchange capacity, so they didn't grow very good grass. So in the 1940s and 50s, they started planting a lot of this land to commercial trees like Christmas trees, and that's what this property was planted in 1952 on a 3-foot by 3-foot spacing for about 35 of the 50 acres. And the trees that were planted were Scots pine, spruce, red pine, and white pine, and the intention was to dig up all the trees in the even numbered rows and all the even numbered trees in the odd numbered rows and sell those for nursery stock, and they would still have a plantation. But they never did that. And the first operation that went on in here after the trees were planted was in 1997, when a logger came in and cut this property to a diameter limit. He said he was going to take out Scots pine, but I never found any Scots pine stumps in here, not a single one. He did take out some of the white pine that were to the legal diameter limit. He also took out all the deciduous trees in here that reached the legal diameter limits for whatever the species was, and there's more than one diameter limit. But this area right that we're looking at here was originally planted to pines in 1952, but it was too wet. And the pines died, and it came up to virtually all silver maple, courtesy of the road department planting silver maple over here on the road back in the early 1900s. So in the 1950s, there were all these massive silver maples that were producing tons, literally tons of seed every year. This was previously, it was the soft maple that grew here was red maple. But those were silver maple over there, and what we have in here is both silver and Freeman maple, the hybrid between the two and the pure silver maple that just blew across the road. There are usually two ways in any tree cutting or tree conservation bylaw that municipalities have. One of them is to do good forestry practices or sustainable forestry practices, where you have to hire a registered professional forester to do a management prescription and then follow that prescription in the marking and the cutting. The diameter limit is easier, and if you don't have professionals on staff that are qualified to do the check it for sustainable practices, then the diameter limit is fairly easy to check, because all the diameter is set at, say, 12 inches off the ground. You may, and then graduated down to 8 inches, 6 inches, and 4 inches. And the tree has to be a certain size. That's all it has to do. The problem with that system is that you take out all the big trees, all the best seed trees, and you leave the rest. And the ones that are tall but skinny, they might tip over, they might put epicormic shoots on, or they may just up and die, because those trees had a very small crown. They were being supported by the bigger trees, and all of a sudden they've got to deal with lots of wind and also lots of sun. And that heat can be very devastating to those trees. The other issue with the diameter limit cutting is that there are certain species that grow faster than others, so those are the first ones you take out, and the other species are the ones that get to supply seed for the next generation. So over time, you probably change the species composition, not because it's the best trees to grow on the site, but they're the only ones left to produce seed. Beech would be a good example of that. I think somebody's been in here. My wheelbarrow wasn't sitting up the last time I was here. Those weren't in the bush the last time I was here either. I'll find out one of these days who that was. They were leaving a message to see if I knew who it was. When we bought this place, there were 5 wet spots. You can see where the bare area is there. This was a water hole until the end of June, from that bare spot there up to this first tree on the right. And I had to buy 12 dump truck loads of fill to fill the 5 water holes that were created by ATVs and dirt bikes. And you saw the pole at the beginning of the property. There's another one where this trail went out. The reason this trail here is here at all is that the local snowmobile club used to have an agreement that they would keep this open in the wintertime and groom it and so on, and it became part of the provincial snowmobile trail. The problem was that the winters got shorter and shorter, and people bought ATVs and dirt bikes, and they like to go mudding in here. And if you can imagine, they took out 12 dump truck loads of dirt on dirt bikes and ATVs. You can imagine how many trips they had to do that. Here we have 3 fairly large or medium-sized sawlog walnuts at the moment, and in behind there's a little one. But look how tall it is. It's almost the same height, but that's a codominant tree, and normally if it was any other species other than walnut, you would cut that little tree down to let the big trees grow faster and give you better quality veneer. But in the case of walnut, the slower it grows and the denser the rings, the better quality veneer that you get out of it. And so in this case, I'm going to leave that little tree for my great-great-grandchildren maybe, but for somewhere way down the road, we'll get a better quality log out of that than the first ones. This one tree here has got very nice form, and it doesn't have any blemishes on it, but it's probably growing fast enough that it wouldn't give you as high a grade as that one over there. Also planted all of this with, and you can see the dead trees in here. Those are mostly all red pine. And over there, you can see that tall white pine in the background. And beside it is a deciduous tree with green that's a bit taller. That's a tulip tree that wasn't here the day they planted that white pine. Because this had been pasture land. So that was, or maybe it was a field, but these were all planted by machines in here, so there wouldn't have been any trees growing. They couldn't plant by machine where there are trees. But this was all planted to pine, but just over in here was 2 black walnut trees that were about 30 inches in diameter when they were cut in 1997. And when I came along in 2008, you could see where there was maybe an 8 or 10 foot log, so, and then the rest of it was just top. So those trees were planted when this was open, and then when it was all planted up to pine in here, the wet ground turned to silver maple, and the dry ground, the squirrels planted them to walnuts, and the walnuts have killed all the pine out. But there's almost 5 acres of virtually pure walnut in here. It's all spice bush. You run into spice bush yet? And the flowering is already done. This was all in flower last week. Oh, look at here. See this was nipped off? But I'm not sure that's a jack-in-the-pulpit. I think that's was a red trillium. And so that'll be deer eating them off. This lady came to our Woodlot Owners Association meeting about 5 or 6 years ago, and she was talking about, you could tell the number of deer per square mile by the condition of your white trillium population. That they virtually wiped them out in Rondo Provincial Park, and then finally they come to an agreement after 15 years of wrangling to let the natives go and shoot whatever deer they wanted in Rondo. And there were certain days of the week that the public who owned the cottages in there weren't allowed in, so that the natives could do their harvest. And I guess the white trims has come back. The morning hunting turkeys, and when I got ready to go, I looked out here to see if I dropped anything, and there was an egg, but she hasn't been back to lay another one. We've owned this property since 2008, and I think we've got 5 deer off of it, and this spring I got my first turkey. Deciduous forest was diameter limit cut in 1997. Then about 2005, maybe 2004, I marked this for the lady for thinning of the pine plantations. And in 2006, Middlesex County, who owned the property across the road, they had several properties, including that one, thinned with a mechanical machine, with a machine. And while he was over there, I talked to him, and he come over here and started harvesting this. But then the frost went out of the ground, and he started leaving ruts about this deep. So whatever logs he had at the road, they shipped them somewhere, and she got paid for them. The rest of them were laying here in piles like this one right beside us here. You can see the close up, there's a bunch of logs, and then in behind there's more. They're still here. I decided it wasn't worthwhile. When I bought the place 2 years later, it wasn't worthwhile to try and do anything with them. The nearest market was Owen Sound, which is a long haul from here. The walnut. This is pin cherry. Not many, you don't find much pin cherry around here. And the biggest I've ever seen is probably 12, 14 centimeters. I've never seen a pin cherry. But I'm guessing that they're going to be as astringent as black cherry. But they made black cherry jelly and choke cherry jelly. They call it choke cherry for a reason. Every year, the bucks come here and they use this as a licking branch, and they have the scrape here. And I had a tree stand up there for about 5 years, never saw a thing. But this, and you can see the ruts that were left when that guy was here. In 2006, they were a lot deeper than that then. They filled in with organic matter. But I kind of like this spot with the reasonably tall pines, and you can see through the place, which is nice. When I first bought the place, I wanted to create a log home log or a veneer log out of every tree on the place. I'm not so concerned about that anymore. And so I put it up on this one. But I didn't want to have to cut new shooting lanes. And then you have to take the tension off the straps at least every 2 years, if not every year. Butterfly, the giant swallowtail. The only thing it lays its eggs on, it lays its eggs on two things, hop tree and this. And hop tree in itself is endangered. Prickly ash There was a more prickly ash in here 10 years ago. It dies out from the shade faster than this spice bush. Something. And there's the vine that gives all vines a bad name. It's the only one that grows around them like that. And it doesn't strangle the tree. This tree strangles itself. It grows around. It's no good to the vine when the tree dies and falls over. But the tree is trying to get bigger. And so it can't get big. It can't push the vine and break it. So it eventually kills itself. Unless it manages to grow over that vine in the meantime. But do you know what vine that is? This is American bittersweet. You'll see a lot of wreaths made from it at Christmas time with the orange petals that stick out in the seed that's kind of a red color in the middle. And there's a sycamore tree right there. There's the leaves. Like a giant maple leaf. Can you see the tree? You can't see the tree, it's camouflaged. So this was always deciduous forest. That was cleared, that's why there's pine growing in there. But there were no walnuts around here, so the walnuts were planted in there. There's some other stuff coming up that's a little more shade tolerant than the pine, but there's no pine regeneration in here at all. Now there used to be pine on this Bothwell clay or sand plain. That's what we're standing on. And up at Strathroy, the Strathroy is there because they built Buchanan's mill to mill the white pine on the Strathroy Caradoc sand plain. And yet there's very few, if any, natural white pine left up there. There are plantations, but there's virtually no white pine plantations up there. And would you believe that they were shipping white pine out of Kent County as late as 1910? They were doing, you know what squared timber is? Do you know what an adze is? It looks like a hoe, but it's heavy duty, and you stand on top of the log and you go like this, and you flatten off that side, and then people with what they call a broad axe. You know how most axes are this shape? A broad axe is this shape. So it's nice and flat on one side, and you go down with it and hack that. So if you look at old barn timbers, you'll see these chips. Those are made either from a broad axe or an adze. It was a really wasteful way to deal with timber, because if it was 22 inches at the top end, you could maybe square that to 16, and it was 30 inches at the bottom and you squared it down to 16. But that's how they shipped timber to Europe up until the 1920s, actually, I think. They were shipping them, as they said, out of pine out of Essex County, where we think of it as clay land, but there was white pine growing down there. They weren't planting anything in 1910. The first tree nursery in Ontario was 1908. That's up at St. William's. Have you read the book 2 Billion Trees and Counting? It's about a fellow by the name of Harold Zavitz. Is it Harold? Edmund Zavitz. And he was the original forester for the Department of Lands and Forests. He started the University of Toronto Faculty of Forestry while he was still becoming a forester himself in Michigan. He was going over to Michigan and get his degree over there and set up a course in Toronto. He started the first nursery in Guelph at what was then the Agricultural the Ontario Agricultural College, and is now the University of Guelph. And the first summer they sent him out to take pictures and make notes of the condition of the agricultural land in southern Ontario. And he went around and took pictures of roads that were covered in 6 or 8 or 10 feet of sand. And in the book, I'm pretty sure that's where I saw this picture. There's a picture of the house that looks a lot like mine, with a sand dune coming up to the edge of the house at a window in the upstairs and going out the door at the other end down on the bottom floor. But visually you can follow that line through the house even though you can't see it, because it just lines up. Pictures of people my height standing underneath the outstretched roots of white pine, with sinker roots going down, and they're standing underneath, and then 6 or 7 feet up off where those roots go out, the stump is cut off. So they cut the stump off, they worked the land like they did here, and it started to blow away and they moved on. Anyway, this is sort of the end of the trail. Thank you for visiting Sherwood Forest. We thank you, and we hope you enjoyed the tour and maybe come and visit in person sometime.